Welcome to Evidence Based, a new Harbinger psychology podcast. We're your hosts, Cassie and Kendall.
On today's episode, we're talking about reclaiming pleasure after sexual trauma. We're joined by Holly Richmond, a somatic psychotherapist, certified sex therapist, licensed marriage and family therapist, and author of Reclaiming Pleasure. She is a frequent contributor to publications and media outlets on the intersection of psychology and sexuality, specializing in the treatment of survivors and the recovery of sexual health after trauma. Hi, Holly. Welcome to Evidence Based. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here with you.
Hi, Holly. So we thought we'd start off with just defining sexual trauma, and we're hoping you could tell us, what do you hope people understand about the impact that it has?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I think my broadest answer is sexual trauma is violating, not violent. So much in our culture, we're conditioned to think trauma is I'm going to have a scar or a bruise, or there's going to be visual evidence of this. And if I don't have that, my trauma wasn't bad enough. It wasn't big enough. It doesn't count. And therefore, I don't speak up. So I think really, especially in the last 5 to 10 years, this idea, again, trauma is bad enough. It only has to be violating. So an emotional violation, perhaps too, especially with sexual trauma, some kind of physical violation, but there doesn't need to be evidence, only how we feel about it. So often my clients will say, I'm not sure if this was traumatic or not. And I say, did it feel traumatic? Did it feel violating in any way? Did it feel abusive? If it felt abusive, it was abusive.
And as we talk about trauma, I wanted to get your opinion or talk a little bit about the difference between. So we hear a lot about when someone suffers from sexual trauma, moving on and the steps that they need to recover and heal. But you go a step further and talk about reclaiming pleasure. And why is that so important? And why is surviving just the beginning?
This idea of reclaiming sexual pleasure, reclaiming great sex and solid relationships is just an area that we haven't looked at a lot. So I feel like, even 20, 25 years ago, the trauma therapy movement was huge and we were making so many advances in trauma therapy. I did my 3,000 hours at a rape crisis center and I was taught very well how to treat the trauma, but I did not know how to treat the what comes next. And again, that what comes next is my clients wanted to have good sex again, whether with themselves or someone else, and really healthy relationships. So I was literally kind of sitting there in the office and I was in my dissertation program and going, okay, I got this far. We're better. We're kind of out of the surviving mode, which you and I can talk a little bit more about. But then what comes after that? And that's that thriving piece. That's that whole life of eroticism, pleasure, connection, kind of connection to purpose, really feeling like a whole human.
And as people move from that surviving to thriving, one of the things you talk about in your book is cultivating clarity around sexual trauma. Can you talk about why that's important and what that is?
Yeah. So I want to preface this by saying the umbrella term sexual trauma is absolutely fine. And as a therapist, I sit with plenty of clients who just like to say sexual trauma. But for a lot of people, calling it what it is really important. So this is one big umbrella term. So you'll hear a lot of people say non-consensual sex. There's really no such thing as non-consensual sex, if we're being honest. It's rape, it's sexual abuse, it's sexual harassment, it's gender violence, it's stalking. I want to call it what it is because of the impact. I feel like when we say non-consensual sex, I'm not sure who we're catering to there. Are we catering to the perpetrators? Are we catering to the patriarchy? And please know, I know all perpetrators are not male-bodied, but who are we catering to? Why are we not calling it rape? Why are we not calling it sexual abuse? So I've found in working with my clients, if I can say, yes, that was sexually abusive because of your age, because you couldn't give consent, or it was rape because there was genital penetration, it helps validate their experience so much. So they really feel like, I'm valid in how I'm feeling, or I'm valid in how my body's expressing itself that I haven't really understood before.
And just a follow-up to that, can you talk about the difference between being a victim of sexual trauma versus a survivor?
And again, here's another case where language is really important, and I'm always client-led. So I'm going to go where the client leads me But I'm also going to give a little bit of an explainer around that. So if someone comes in and says, I'm a victim of sexual trauma, I'm going to listen to that. And then I would say, hey, in my training, I was taught to always use the word survivor because a survivor kind of grounds us in this hopeful, forward looking position of everything that you've lived through, all of the things you've done since experiencing your sexual trauma. Whereas victim feels a little bit more pathologizing, it keeps us stuck, and it tends to look back. We use survivor clinically. We're going to use victim in a legal or law enforcement situation just for clarity. But when I'm talking to a client, it's always going to be survivor unless they flat out tell me, hey, I don't like that word. I'd rather be called a victim of sexual abuse.
And as we continue to kind of set the stage and establish some of these clarifications around terms and things that you use in your book, I wanted to talk a little bit about in your book, you talk about sexual health and that it isn't a bonus, it's a necessity. Can you elaborate on that and just kind of describe what you mean by the term in general?
Yeah, so sexual health as a definition from the World Health Organization, it wasn't until 2002, I believe, that pleasure was even included in the definition. So it was just about consent. And you guys know my sex positive position. All sex is good sex as long as it's consensual and pleasurable. Pleasure is just the piece of the sex equation that's just been left out. We haven't, I know, my generation, it was just don't get an STI, don't get pregnant, don't be a slut, right? There's nothing about, oh, by the way, you should be enjoying sex. None of that. I think young people today know pleasure is a piece of this. But when we're really talking about sexual health, we have to include pleasure as part of the discussion. So, of course, there's consent. Of course, there's shared values. Of course, there's open communication. And there's pleasure.
And in your work, you use the term survivor security system. Can you talk about what that is and why it's important to listen to what your body is trying to tell you?
Yeah, so this was really informed from the somatic psychology point of view. So just as a basic overview, I figured out pretty quickly that I couldn't study trauma if I wasn't studying the body, and I couldn't study the body if I wasn't studying sexuality. So that's how kind of the three pieces of my practice go together. I am a somaticizer, and I didn't understand that until I really needed to understand that. So what that means is my body will let me know that something's wrong long before my brain catches up. So I would have chronic pain and it would move all over my body. And one week it would be one thing, and then next week the other thing. And it really took me doing my work and understanding that this was coming from trauma from my past. And my body was just trying to say, hey, listen to me, listen to me. And I'm going to tap you, and then I'm going to nudge you, and then I'm going to push you over with this chronic illness or this pain to finally get you to listen to me. So many survivors of sexual trauma come in and there is a somatic symptom or a somatic manifestation of symptoms that it's happening. And they've been told by doctors, there's nothing wrong with you. Yeah, there's MRIs, scans, all the things. There's nothing wrong with you. So we have to look to the past, to what happened to them, how their nervous system is really hyper activated, hyper aroused, help them find safety, help them ground themselves in the present moment instead of the past, so that we can really listen to what's going on and tend to it instead of pathologizing ourselves or saying, what's wrong with me? Why can't I do this? Why can't I just be normal? Instead of looking at the body and saying, oh, you're trying to tell me something. Thank you for trying to keep me safe.
I think it's really interesting how, in many episodes, when we've talked with therapists, we've kind of come to the conclusion that a lot of somatic symptoms associated with trauma, anxiety, depression are often dismissed, like you're saying, and or it's oh, it's just an anxiety attack, or oh, it's just panic disorder, or things like that. And it's like, well, oh, it's just, it's very real and very frightening. And so, as we're talking about those somatic symptoms in your book, you talk about a pro-symptom approach. Could you expand on that a little bit and how that plays into the somatic symptoms people may be feeling?
Yeah, so it's really just getting curious with the symptom. What are you trying to say that I cannot? Right? So the words are not coming out of my mouth because I can't grasp them cognitively. And that's not because I'm not smart, it's not because I don't get it, any of those things. It's just the body has a language that until we attune to it, we're just not tapped into. So it's looking at the chronic pain, it's looking at the stomach distress. What can't I swallow? It's looking at the throat, the constant constriction, or the sinuses. What am I not saying that I need to? When we really tune into the part of the body that's trying to speak to us and figure out what the message is, from there we have the awareness, then we have the understanding, and from that the behavior change. So that's really the spectrum that I work with: awareness, understanding, behavior change. And when we do that somatically, we have a whole nother lens to look through. So we're not just talking to the brain, but we're talking to the body.
And moving a little bit onto the brain, shame, I feel like, is a big thing that comes up with sexual trauma. Can you talk about the role that shame plays in keeping survivors from reclaiming their pleasure? And how can they move from shame to empathy?
Mhm. Shame is a huge one, and I know that it's part of the human condition. We all experience shame, but I feel like with survivors of sexual trauma, because sexuality is still somewhat taboo and we're not given a language around it, that almost immediately goes deep inside, gets hidden. When we hide things, when we do things in secret, when we're isolated, the shame grows and oftentimes the pain grows. So that's how the shame part of the somatic psychology part comes together, because it's just our bodies either in hypoarousal, so we're in that depressive state, or the hyperarousal and that anxiety panic attack state, and we're trying to get back to stasis in the middle and really find fluidity and flexibility instead of rigidity.
As we're talking about shame, like you said, it is a huge topic, of course, when related to sexual trauma. But I wanted to go back to something we talked about in the beginning, that a lot of the conversation about sexual trauma is just working to a place of healing from the trauma versus going that step further to reclaiming pleasure. And so I just wondered, in your opinion, what role does shame play in that progression to taking a step forward to reclaiming pleasure? And why do you think shame has anything to do with why we don't talk about it as much?
I do. And what shame does, in the book, I talk about letting ourselves off the hook, or what the hook is. And the hook is shame. So survivors of sexual trauma first don't want to talk about it because, oh, it's sexual and I haven't been given the language. I haven't been given permission to talk about this. And the second thing is, with sexual trauma, again, most of the time it's not violent, it's violating. So is there some way that I was complicit in it, is what most survivors of sexual trauma think. Why didn't I say no? Why did this happen to me? I was some way in complicit. So I went home with this woman. I wanted to make out, but I didn't want to do this, but it's my fault because I went there. That is the narrative that's going on in their head. So they just shut that down, and then we funnel into shame, 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 shame. It becomes a secret, right? Instead of saying, okay, when I let myself off the hook, I can see where I wasn't complicit here. I can see that not using my voice in that situation was a drive to keep myself safe, because if I had jumped up and screamed, no, you're awful, I'm going to call the police, would I have been hurt even more? Right? So it's just like, that's the fawn response. So we all know the three F's: fight, flight, freeze. Fawn, so much of sexual trauma is in that fawn response, which is going along to get along, being nice, doing whatever we can to get out of that situation without getting hurt any worse. That's the hook. And the hook leads directly to shame. Once we can dislodge the hook and be like, oh, that was just my words trying to take care of me. That was just my body trying to take care of me. I did the best thing I could have possibly done in that situation. Then we free ourselves from the shame.
I also wanted to ask too about comparing traumas. Like, I know, when somebody has something happen to them and they're kind of trying to downplay it, they'll always say, someone had it worse than me. And I wondered what your opinion on that was. And I think that kind of goes along with shame and comparison.
It absolutely does. There's a part of me when I answer this question, I always want to say, I wish we could measure suffering. Like, I wish we could measure it. It just doesn't come in a measurable framework like that. Cassie, something that felt super traumatic for you might not feel traumatic for me. Something that feels traumatic for me, you would be like, Holly, that's, that you would never say this, but you would be like, oh, that wouldn't have been a big deal for me. That is okay. We all bring with us our past, right? So where we sit in this present moment, that's all going to be impacted by how our support systems, our level of resiliency, mostly the support systems, to be honest. Like, where do I have that I can lean on? So when we get to this place of comparing suffering, it never works. Someone is going to feel like I'm making too big of a deal out of this, or someone could feel like, oh my gosh, what I went through was so much worse than what anyone else ever has. Then that puts them in the victim position instead of the survivor position. So neither are a good idea. So it's just, I'm so sorry that happened to you. How can I support you? Is there anything I can do?
I think that's great, to talk about the comparing of traumas, because I think that's something we see a lot when people are kind of having that discourse on the internet and things like that. And people can be very discouraging to other people who have come out with, a story that they, or, something that has happened to them in their own personal experience. So I think it's encouraging to remember that not all traumas are felt the same to everyone. So I appreciate that. Um, and as we're talking about kind of looking at this holistically, I wanted to ask, why is identifying the emotional impacts, the physical consequences, sexual repercussions, and relational effects of sexual trauma important? The whole picture.
Yeah. Again, because I feel like mostly in therapy, we look at the emotional. And when I was studying this, of course, then I added in the sexual, but I was like, okay, if I'm looking at the somatic, then we have to look at the physical. And all of us live in relationship. Even if we aren't in a romantic relationship, we all live in relationship. So to me, I just kind of pictured this wheel with the four quadrants and honing in with each and every client, where are we in the wheel, what parts need to be, really looked at. Again, awareness, understanding, behavior change. Some people, some survivors have really great relationships, that piece of the wheel is solid, but they might have a ton of somatic symptoms, so that's where we're looking. Or their body could be very healthy, and then they tell me, oh my gosh, I've never even looked at my vulva, or I've never masturbated, I've never had an orgasm. So then we know that we're really looking at the sexual repercussions. It just gives me a lens of where to start from. So for me, it's just a nice, easy gauge of what parts of this quadrant are full, what parts need more attention.
So I feel like we've laid the groundwork about the surviving part, and I want to move a little into thriving. And I thought we could start there by talking about the term reclaiming pleasure and what that means.
So in my dissertation, what I looked at then, so I looked at, my hypothesis was the recovery of sexual health after sexual assault. So I was really looking specifically at sexual assault. Reclaiming pleasure looks at all of sexual trauma, but so I discovered three parameters in my dissertation. The first is control, maintaining and relinquishing. The second parameter is pleasure, where most of the juice is. And then the third parameter is connection. And again, just because of the world that we live in, our lack of language and the lack of prioritizing pleasure, I felt like for the cultural narrative, for a book for lay people, not just for clinicians, that having this focus on pleasure was really the place to start. And it's fascinating, still fascinating to me, not even just survivors of sexual trauma, how few of us prioritize our pleasure. And when I am working with a survivor, I'm not going to go straight into, let's look at your sexual pleasure, let's get you on a self-pleasure protocol. We're going to be looking at pleasure in life. So this can be from movement, this can be from food and drink and textures and smell. So this is just for any listeners. If you're afraid of the book, don't be afraid of the book. It goes very slowly, and I do not throw you into the deep end of the sexuality. We really look at pleasure inclusively to figure out where that's coming into your life, where you don't have a lot of it. I mentioned the terms rigidity and fluidity before. A lot of survivors are very constricted and rigid as an attempt to keep themselves safe. But when we keep ourselves safe and constricted from the bad things, the good things get left out too. So it's really just reclaiming pleasure is this beautiful opening up to the diversity of the human experience.
I really appreciate kind of like stepping into pleasure, even non sexually, with things that are just bringing you a sense of joy and, like you said, physical movement, things like that. So I think that's a really great example of how, because I could see as a survivor, it could be really difficult, to go straight into the deep end, like you said, on a sexual spectrum. And as we're talking about kind of a more solutions based conversation, what is a sexual template, and how can survivors begin to discover theirs, as you talk about in your book?
Yeah, so this is part of the process in therapy that I really get excited about. So the sexual template I break down into two categories, and the first is desire, the second is arousal. Desire I define as the psychological process of wanting. Arousal I define as the physiological process of wanting. So desire is, what do I find sexy? What am I attracted to? Arousal is more of the body-based, what turns me on. And again, I'm going to have my clients go out into the world and discover, is it a leather jacket? Is it a fluffy blanket? Is it a glass of wine? Is it a piece of dark chocolate? What are you drawn to? And then from there, we go more into the sexual, more into the body based of, what do you notice sensation wise that gets you going? And most people have never done this. When I sit down, all of my clients, survivors or not, and say, let's talk about what you like, what you're into, I get a blank stare. So I'm hoping as we become more sex positive as a culture that we'll all be paying a little bit more attention to our sexual templates, to owning what we like, to asking for what we need. Again, coming back to that sex positive perspective, all sex is good sex as long as it's pleasurable and consensual. So we're not pathologizing people for what they want, who they want, how they move through the world as sexual beings.
Yeah, and a big part of sex is the connection, and you talk about connected sex in your book. Can you elaborate on what that is? And you also mention sometimes that means planned sex is better sex, and so I'm curious to get your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. So again, the protocol is control. So of course, it makes sense. Survivors are going to need to feel like they have control. So we talk about maintaining control, relinquishing control, pleasure, which includes the sexual template. So okay, that makes sense, logical. The pleasure piece is a ton of fun. And then we get to the connection piece. And that's where I look at my clients are like, oh my gosh, now I have to go actually out in the world and do this work. The connection is scary because they've been hurt in connection. Sexual trauma happens in connection, happens in relationship, so it has to be healed in relationship. Even if it wasn't physical, even if the sexual trauma was emotional, there's still some relationship built around it. Connection can be with a romantic partner, it can be with community, it can be with family, it can be with friends. I am not a sex therapist who is like, everybody needs to be out there having a ton of sex. That's not what it means. I want every person to define sex for themselves as an individual being. How does sex feel good for you? How does it feel healthy for you? And for whom would having sex feel good with? So is this yourself? Of course, we're going to work on the self first, and then in connection with a partner if that's what they choose. Even more deeply, I take a Tantra perspective. So, Tantra literally translates to the weave. So, it's not crazy positions, it's not multiple orgasms. It can be all that, but it translates to the weave. And it often starts with eye gazing and just really deep connection being together, not, more fantastical aspects of sex. It's really about that deepness, that authenticity, and the vulnerability.
And on the topic of connection, I want to talk about pleasure versus performance. And in your opinion, why do survivors often feel the need to perform versus connect during sexual experiences?
Yeah. Connection is scary because it does ask us to show up vulnerably and authentically. It's so much easier to watch porn and be like, oh, that's what I'm supposed to do. So I'll just go into that script and perform. And then I don't have to show up and ask for what I need, ask for what I want, use my voice. This is really hard for survivors. Again, especially if they went into the fawn response during their sexual trauma, a lot of times then their nervous system learns, hey, just go along to get along, don't say anything, this will be over soon. My pleasure protocol turns that completely on its head. The connection turns that completely on its head. First figure out what you want and then learn how to ask for it. The performance is in some ways easier, but it disconnects us from our bodies.
Earning your continuing education hours doesn't have to be a painful experience. The right course can open your mind to new possibilities, increase your confidence, and hand you powerful tools to transform your clients' lives. Praxis Continuing Education and Training teams up with some of the brightest minds in mental health to provide cutting edge, evidence based training for practitioners. You can learn firsthand from experts like Stephen C. Hayes, Kelly Wilson, Robin Walzer, Kirk Strassel, and many others. Find your next training at praxiscet.com. That's praxiscet.com.
How can someone who's maybe not as self-aware start to notice when they're moving into that performance versus connection?
hmm Um, they will not feel in their body. I think they would notice really not being there. What I would ask them to focus on is literally good sensations on their body. In the book, I use a version of the Sensate Focus Protocol, which was developed by Masters and Johnson back in the 60s. And Sensate Focus focuses on sensation, so non genital sensation. That's where I would ask them to start. And it's hard to go into a performance script if we're really focused on, oh my gosh, your hand on my shoulders or your hands on my chest feel really good right now. They're going to notice being in their head about what should I do next? What should my body be looking like? What should my body be smelling like? Oh my gosh, I made that sound. I'm going into shame. So all of that, it's just very heady versus being in your body. So that's probably what they're going to notice first is like having a script about how it should go.
That's important, and I think that's a good distinction of feeling your body versus being in your head. Um, and as as we have our sexual template, as we start to think about connected sex, what does it mean to reimagine sex, and what are some examples of ways to do this?
Hmm. This is really where I bring in that component of eroticism or eros, Eros. So eros translates to life force, vitality, vivacity. In our culture, when we hear the word erotic, we tend to think about it sexually, and it absolutely can be sexual, but where it starts is life force. What brings me alive? And when we show up to sex, with that life force, with that vitality, with the creativity or the co creation, sex is so much more than an act of physicality. It really becomes this whole mind body experience that when people finally have good connected sex, they're like, oh my gosh, what I was doing before was just a performance, or I was a shell and I was just doing what I thought I should do. It's such a deeper, richer experience. And then we get to decide what sex is. Is it penis and vagina? Is it penetration at all? Does it include oral? Does it not? Is it just cuddling? We get to create that experience every time we are with ourselves or with another partner instead of just expecting, oh, because I'm female bodied and they're male bodied, it's going to be penetrative sex. That's a really old, outdated way of looking at connected, deep sex. And for survivors of trauma, that's incredibly important that they redefine it each time they go into a sexual or erotic experience.
Yeah, I definitely feel like that becomes a blanket term as well. Sex just automatically includes intercourse and that's it. And we don't reimagine those other experiences. So I think that's important across the board. And you started to talk about it, but I wanted to elaborate on it. In your book, you talk about the power of eroticism. Can you talk about that a little bit and why it's helpful when it comes to sexual recovery? Even though I know we've started into this conversation.
Yeah, well, it's just I didn't even know I was talking about it for a long time. Eroticism and the concept of eros. I want to give a shout out to Esther Perel because I feel like she was one of the first ones that stepped into this space and was studying it. But I think for survivors, what I'm finding is it's impossible to have good sex unless we know who we are and unless we can ask for what we want. And eroticism really demands that of us. Show up as your full self. Tell me who you are. Tell me what's important to you. Use your voice. Use empathy. Feel like you can be connected here. Like you don't have to shut down. You don't have to be small. Um, and tell your story. And we can tell the story with words or we can tell the story with our bodies, but it's really co created. I think that's this place of creation and what sex means to us. And it's going to be different for every person. And I'm still fascinated every single day when I sit down with my clients. What does sex mean to you? And where that goes. And it is certainly not the act of sex, but it's the construction of sex, the meaning of sex.
I think that's pretty powerful that, in your work that you're still seeing different ways that people define it. And I think that's something that, isn't common. Like everyone just thinks it's one thing, but it can be literally anything that's important to you. Um, So, as we start to wrap up, what advice would you give someone who is starting their journey from surviving to thriving and on their way to reclaiming pleasure?
Mhm. So the first thing is it was bad enough. If you're feeling bad, it was bad enough. So again, remembering that construct of it was violating, it doesn't need to be violent. The second is to tell your story. And this might feel most comfortable with a therapist, but you never have to share the details. But just walking into a therapist's office and saying, "Hey, I think I experienced sexual abuse." And you never need to tell the details of your story. We're not looking for validation here. If you're feeling bad about it, it was bad enough. And then find support. So if you're getting support from a therapist, that's great. But if you're getting support from your community, and again, it could be um, a group practice, so group therapy with other survivors on the ground level, or it could just be I donate my time at the local animal shelter, and just being around other people and animals gives me that sense of validation and connection and authenticity. So first, it's telling your story, at least just saying the words, "I'm a survivor," or "I was a victim," or "this happened to me," but not needing to validate yourself, and then moving out into the world without being on the hook, with really feeling like I can own this and I can move through it and I am resilient and I have my authenticity and I've looked at my sexual health and I know who I am as an erotic person, and then find connection with people who honor that in you.
I think a lot of people will feel what you just said very deeply, Holly. So I appreciate that. And did you have any final thoughts as we wrap up the conversation? Anything you'd like to leave the listeners with?
Gosh, every time I have this conversation, I feel like the complicit piece is still like this is the hardest part for survivors of sexual trauma, because it is complex and it is nuanced. So if you were feeling at all complicit in what happened to you, I hope you can just start gently removing that hook, because you didn't do anything. This happened to you. The shame and blame are with the perpetrator. Yeah, that I'm getting a little bit choked up right now. How survivors keep themselves on the hook of keeping that shame and blame, that needs to come out so you can really be your fully realized, self-actualized sexual human, erotic human, and living in that place of thriving.
Well, I think that you have given people a very good space to learn more about this and to transition, like you said, from surviving to thriving. And so we're very appreciative of your work and your time and your expertise in having this conversation with us.
Oh, I so appreciate the invitation. This was lovely. Thank you both for your really thoughtful questions.
Thank you, Holly.
If you have experienced sexual abuse, assault, harassment, or rape, you may feel disconnected from your sexual self, even if you've overcome the initial trauma of your experience. You are a survivor, but surviving is just the beginning. This book explores what comes next. Written by a psychotherapist and grounded in cutting edge research, Reclaiming Pleasure picks up where other sexual trauma recovery books leave off. It offers practical tools to help you cultivate a sense of safety, security, and trust in order to reclaim the vitality, pleasure, and great sex you deserve. The book will also serve as your compass on a journey toward the rediscovery of desire, letting you explore what you want from others and for yourself. This groundbreaking book will help you understand the lasting mental, physical, sexual, and relational impacts of sexual trauma, move beyond feelings of shame, reclaim pleasure, and reignite passion in your life. Visit our website at www.newharbinger.com and use coupon code podcast25 to receive 25% off your entire order.
New Harbinger Publications is an independent, employee owned publisher of books on psychology, health, spirituality, and personal growth. For nearly 50 years, our evidence based self help books and pioneering workbooks have helped readers make positive changes to improve mental health and well being. Founded by psychologists Matthew McKay and Patrick Fanning, New Harbinger is proud to be an employee owned company. Our books reflect our core values of integrity, sustainability, compassion, and trust. Written by leaders in the field and recommended by therapists worldwide, New Harbinger books are practical, accessible, and provide real tools for real change.
Join the New Harbinger Clinicians Club, a free membership club exclusively for mental health professionals. Sign up today and you'll receive a special welcome gift, 35% off all professional books, free client resources, free ebooks throughout the year, access to private sales, a subscription to our Quick Tips for Therapists email program, and more. Visit newharbinger.com/clinicians-club for more information.
If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love if you rated, reviewed, and subscribed to the show, and we hope you might share it with anyone who might benefit from the content. This podcast is not a substitute for counseling with a licensed provider.